At 2:40 in the morning, Beirut is not just attacked, it is torn out of sleep with such violence that for a few seconds people do not even understand what world they are standing in. A mother wakes to shattered glass spraying across her child's bed. A father grabs his phone, then drops it because the floor itself jolts beneath him. In one apartment, someone screams that the building is collapsing. In another, the electricity cuts out, and a family runs down a black stairwell guided only by the orange glow of fire outside. This is how the night begins, not with a headline, not with a military briefing. It begins with ordinary people realizing in the span of a heartbeat that the walls around them may not survive the next blast. And as Beirut stumbles awake in terror, another sound arrives, the long, low roar of warplanes overhead, followed by the truth no city ever wants to hear. This is not one strike, not one warning shot, not one brief exchange. This is the start of a night that will leave bodies under rubble, families on roadsides, and an entire region staring at the edge of something much bigger. By sunrise, the scale of the shock is already hard to process. Lebanese officials and major news agencies report that Israeli strikes have killed at least 50 people in Lebanon and wounded more than 335 as the latest round of fighting explodes outward. The United Nations says at least 30,000 people have already been pushed into collective shelters, with many more sleeping in cars or trapped in traffic trying to escape. Schools in Beirut that should have opened their doors to children are instead being turned into emergency spaces for families carrying blankets, medicine, and whatever they manage to snatch before running into the dark. This is the image that defines the opening of the crisis. Not soldiers advancing on a map, but civilians dragged from sleep into chaos, trying to explain to frightened children why they cannot go back home. But the real shock, the part that turns this from a local tragedy into a regional earthquake, is that Beirut is not burning because of a single isolated clash. Beirut is burning because the war has widened. Days earlier, on February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a major assault on Iran. Reuters reported that the operation hit Iranian military and nuclear-related targets, including Natanz, and that Iranian state media announced the death of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. That one event changed the entire temperature of the Middle East in a matter of hours. Once the report of Khamenei's death spread, the region stopped asking whether there would be retaliation and started asking where it would land first, how many fronts would ignite, and how quickly civilians would be pulled into it. Iran answered with missile fire at Israel and attacks linked to American interests in the region, while intelligence assessments cited by Reuters warned of further Iranian strikes against U.S. targets after Khamenei's death. Shipping routes and military sites across the Gulf suddenly looked exposed. Energy markets shook. Governments rushed to assess whether they were staring at a contained exchange or the opening stage of a regional war. And inside Lebanon, Hezbollah was watching all of it, calculating not just what had happened to Iran, but what silence would mean for its own position after the killing of the man who symbolized the axis it belongs to. Then came the move that shattered the already fragile calm on the Lebanon-Israel front. In the early hours of March 2nd, Hezbollah launched rockets and drones from Lebanese territory into northern Israel, ending the ceasefire that had mostly held since November 2024. The group openly tied its action to the wider confrontation and to the killing of Khamenei. That decision changed Beirut's fate almost instantly. Israel responded with force across Lebanon, including strikes in the southern suburbs of Beirut, saying it was targeting Hezbollah command centers and weapons depots. For military spokespeople, these were strategic targets. For the people in those neighborhoods, they were apartment blocks nearby, roads they use every day, windows breaking at 2 in the morning, and the sound of children crying in parking lots while adults scan the sky for the next incoming strike. And here is where the first 2 minutes of this story hit hardest, because the audience needs to feel the unbearable contradiction at the center of this war. On paper, everyone speaks in the language of strategy, deterrence, retaliation, command infrastructure, defensive positions, offensive operations. But in real life, war arrives as dust in the lungs of people who never touched a weapon. It arrives as grandparents trying to descend broken staircases. It arrives as a mother counting children in the back seat while traffic does not move. It arrives as a classroom turned into a shelter before breakfast. If you want to understand what is happening in Beirut, do not begin with generals. Begin with the families who ran barefoot into the street and looked up to see drones over their own neighborhood. That is the human center of this crisis, and it is the reason every new escalation now feels like a gamble with entire cities. As the strikes intensified, Israel issued evacuation warnings across dozens of Lebanese areas. Reuters and other outlets reported that residents in parts of southern Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, and Beirut's southern suburbs were told to leave areas suspected of housing Hezbollah-linked infrastructure. AP reported that Israeli warnings extended to more than 80 villages in southern Lebanon, while UN agencies said the displacement was spreading rapidly across the south, the Bekaa, and the southern suburbs of Beirut. In plain language, that meant tens of thousands of civilians were being told that even if they had survived the night, they might not survive the day if they stayed where they were. What makes this even more extraordinary is that Lebanon's own government has begun publicly confronting Hezbollah in a way rarely seen so directly. Prime Minister Nawaf Salam declared Hezbollah's military and security activities illegal and said security forces should prevent attacks from Lebanese territory. President Joseph Aoun said the decision over war and peace belongs solely to the Lebanese state and described the move as sovereign and irreversible. That is not routine rhetoric. That is Lebanon's leadership effectively saying that an armed group inside the country has no right to pull the nation into a catastrophic war. But strong language does not automatically create strong control, and that is the trap Lebanon now finds itself in. A state asserting authority in the middle of a conflict it may not have the power to contain. On the ground, the military balance is shifting dangerously. Reuters reported that Israel deployed additional forces into southern Lebanon, describing the move as defensive and limited to the border zone. AP and other reporting said Israeli troops had taken strategic positions and that the Lebanese army had been repositioning as the fighting escalated. UNIFIL also confirmed temporary Israeli incursions. To audiences watching from far away, these may sound like technical battlefield developments, but every such move sends a message to civilians. The line separating air war from ground war is getting thinner. Once troops begin settling into positions across a border, the fear is no longer just about one night of bombing. The fear becomes that the conflict is entering a longer, uglier phase. Hezbollah, for its part, has shown no sign that it intends to step back quickly. AP reported that the group said it was ready for an open war, while other reports said it launched a swarm of drones at Israel's Ramat David Air Base, targeting radar sites and control rooms. That matters because it shows the pattern of escalation is not slowing. One side strikes Beirut and southern Lebanon. The other side answers with drones and missiles. Each action is framed as a response, but the overall effect is a staircase going down, one step at a time, into a wider war neither civilians nor fragile governments can easily stop. And at the heart of all of this is Beirut, a city that has become a symbol not because it is untouched by history, but because history keeps hitting it and it keeps standing anyway. Beirut has survived civil war, invasion, bombardment, economic collapse, and the port explosion of 2020. It has rebuilt itself so many times that resilience has become part of its reputation. But resilience is not invincibility. Every return comes with a cost. A family that leaves and never comes back. A child who learns to identify drones by sound. A street rebuilt in concrete but never in memory. Every time Beirut survives, it survives with a little less of what it once was. That is the haunting truth beneath the headlines. Cities do not only die when they are erased, they also fade when generation after generation is taught that fear is normal. So where does this leave the audience trying to understand what matters most tonight? It leaves them with three brutal facts. First, this is no longer just a Lebanon-Israel flare-up. It is tied directly to the US-Israel assault on Iran and the aftermath of Khamenei's reported death. Second, the humanitarian cost is already severe, with at least 50 killed in Lebanon, more than 335 wounded, and at least 30,000 displaced into shelters as the conflict spreads. Third, the political guardrails that might have limited escalation are weakening. Hezbollah has resumed open confrontation. Israel has expanded military operations and troop deployments, and Lebanon's state is trying to reassert control in the middle of active war. And that is why this story should end not with a slogan, but with an image. Imagine Beirut just before dawn, smoke hanging low over the southern suburbs, school buildings filling with displaced families, roads jammed with people who do not know where safety is anymore, and parents telling children to keep moving while the sound of aircraft circles overhead. That is the real meaning of escalation. Not only missiles crossing borders, but ordinary life being stripped away in real time. Beirut has survived nights like this before. The question now is not whether the city knows how to endure. The question is how many more times it can be forced to prove it.